This is a great group of people, and I still see people popping in. So as I'm talking, I'm sure we'll get some more people to join. I want to thank everybody for joining us today for this really important topic. And I'm Caitlin Ellis, the Executive Director of Find the Cause. I'm super excited for today's program. And like so many of you, I live in a town with an elevated level of PFAS in the water supply. So before we begin, I wanted to talk a little bit about Find the Cause and today's speakers who are being so generous with their time, and we're so happy to have you today. And it's so great to see, as I look down here, so many supporters on the Zoom call today. It's that people that have really stood by Find the Cause and believe in what we're doing. And if you aren't familiar with us, Find the Cause is a nonprofit organization dedicated to funding the research of breast cancer prevention, as well as educating the public on ways to decrease the risk of exposure. So this topic was very timely. And all of this work is made possible by the generosity of our supporters. So many are on the call, and a huge thanks to them. If you haven't had a chance to follow us on social media, here's a plug for more information on great topics that we discuss weekly. So give us a follow on social media. Better yet, visit our website. I encourage you to sign up for our emails and learn more about our education programs, as well as the research that's going on in the labs. Find the Cause funds a consortium of scientists working on primary and secondary cancer prevention. And this effort is led by Consortium Director, Dr. David Scher, who's with us today. Dr. Scher is a molecular biologist, toxicologist, and cancer immunologist who studies cellular receptors that recognize a wide variety of environmental pollutants that signals to both grow and metastasize. He is internationally recognized expert on the aryl hydrocarbon receptor, a protein that binds to environmental carcinogens and begins the aberrant signaling that results in a full-blown cancer cell. Dr. Scher is a professor of environmental health, professor of pathology and laboratory medicine at Boston University Public School of Health, School of Medicine, director of Boston University's Superfund Research Program, and co-director of the Cancer Interception Program, Boston University Cancer Center. So also joining us today, which we are thrilled about, is Dr. Wendy Heiger-Bernays. Dr. Heiger-Bernays is a clinical professor in the Department of Environmental Health at the BU School of Public Health, where she applies her training in molecular toxicology to practical questions about the impact of industrial chemicals, consumer products, and pharmaceuticals in water and waste streams on people's health. Her career objective, much aligned with Find the Cause, is to decrease health risks to impacted populations from exposures to environmental stressors. She currently serves as a member of the Massachusetts DEP Waste Site Advisory Committee and the Science Advisory Board for the Toxics Use Reduction Institute, and is chair of her local Board of Health. We are so grateful to both David and Wendy for sharing your knowledge today with us to help us better understand the forever chemical that's being found in our drinking water. So I'll turn it over to David.
Thanks very much, Caitlin. Thanks everybody for joining us, and all the donors for Find the Cause that keep us all above water and not in the water that has PFAS in it. So today, Dr. Heiger-Bernays and I are going to talk maybe 20, 25 minutes about the background of PFAS, and then we're going to open it up to questioning, because I'm sure everybody really wants to know how these kinds of exposures relate specifically to them. So I'm just going to start off just defining these forever chemicals. It's a large class of chemicals that look like this. And you'll often see them referred to as C8. These are carbon atoms, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So it's a long chain of carbon atoms. I'm not going to hypnotize you with molecular structures, but the point I wanted to make here is that there's this attachment of several fluorine groups. So fluorine is generally not a great thing to be sticking onto carbon like this. We humans and animals and bacteria, for the most part, do not have enzymes that can break this stuff down. So that's why they're called forever chemicals. They really last a long time in the environment. And just to give you a little bit of a just sort of nomenclature about what we're talking about, we generally talk about these PFASs, the per or polyfluoroalkyl substances. But that represents a large class, as you'll see, many, many chemicals. It includes some of the more famous ones like PFAS and PFOA, some of the original ones that have been made, and others that have been made since. And there are now new versions of these things called Gen X, and we'll talk about that a little bit in a little while. And to give you a little more perspective on what people have been able to study up until this point, there are now about 4,700 PFAS chemicals. And the ones that are measured, usually we only measure for 6 to 8 of them for lots of reasons. So you're looking at a very small piece of the pie. All this stuff out here is really, for the most part, unknown. What they do are unknown. Their composition often is proprietary. There are mixtures of these things in various products. It's very hard to parse out what all of these chemicals are doing. So the sources of PFAS, I'm sure most of you are familiar with much of this now. It's getting hard to avoid knowledge about these chemicals as well as avoiding the chemicals themselves. They're common in nonstick software, paper and packaging, and I'll drill down a little further on that in a minute. Firefighting foams, carpet that's water and stain resistant, seemed like some great idea in the 1950s, not such a great idea now. Various clothing, shampoo and conditioners, outdoor sporting equipment and indoor sporting equipment, paint, varnishes, and dyes. Paint's always a great source of bad stuff. Toothpaste and some dental floss, the ones that go through your teeth very easily. Those are the ones that have some coating that contains some of these PFAS chemicals. Certain cosmetics, cleaning products like wax, for example, the Simonized wax, and fabric softeners, fast food wrappers and containers. So here are some of the company names that you might recognize. Gore-Tex, which you see everywhere. And when we used to see it on clothing, we'd say, great, get me that. I'm not going to get wet. Maybe not such a hot idea anymore. So let me drill down a little bit further on the sources of these PFASs and their distribution. There's a recent study by the EPA that said 79% of all nonstick coating pans have the original PFAS, PTFE. So PTFE was actually discovered in the whole PFAS family was discovered accidentally by a guy named Roy Plunkett in 1937 working for DuPont. And ironically, he was trying to find a substitute for the refrigerants that they had back in those days, refrigerants we now know to be also really bad for the environment in particular. And what he had accidentally discovered was PTFE, and then not long after that, it became clear the many applications that you could use this PTFE for in terms of keeping things dry, making them non-stick, making them slippery. So 79% of these non-stick pans have it. And even when they say they don't have it, you don't know for sure. So for example, here's a product sold by Bed Bath & Beyond. It's a stone earth frying pan. Stone earth, that sounds healthy, right? And they will tell you what is not in here. Let's say it has no coating. It's free of the Gen X, which is the next generation's PFASs, some of these others, but it doesn't specifically say no PTFE. It actually has PTFE. So it's kind of difficult to even know what to be wary of. And then various kinds of packaging like dessert bread wrappers, basically to keep it dry so that the oil doesn't soak through the paper. Wrappers, paperboard, paper cups, not so much. 46% of the food contact paper has these fluorine, which is one or another of these compounds. Just for perspective, it's recommended that anything above 100 parts per million is okay for composting. But the McDonald's cardware clamshell has 605 parts per million, so way over that level. Burger King, 240, and you go to a salad place like Sweet Green to get something healthy. Their molded bowl has over 1,000 ppm of fluorinated compounds. And then there's the famous aqueous firefighting foam, or AFF, or AFFF, or as I refer to it, the F word. This stuff was invented in around the 1950s and was mandated by the US Navy to be used aboard ships and elsewhere after a very devastating and fatal fire aboard one of their aircraft carriers, the Forrestal. And up until 2018, the FAA required that airports test their firefighting foam by spraying them on the ground or spraying them up on mock airplanes that contained AFF, AFFF. So you'll see a lot of the contamination in our environment is because of proximity to these airports where this is basically spilled onto the ground. In the last 3 years, they have realized this is not such a great thing and have now started substituting other compounds. But that's a lot of AFFF that gets spread on the ground. And so with all that known, it's not hugely surprising that 95% of us have PFAS in our bodies, 100% of human breast milk, so mothers are passing it on to their children. Okay, so we are all exposed, we all carry it. What are the consequences of PFAS exposure and how do you determine these consequences? So again, the brief history is this guy Plunkett identified PFTE in 1930s accidentally. 3M immediately realized the value of it, began commercial production. 1956, PFAS was shown to bind to proteins in the blood. So that was the first indication that these compounds could have some biologic effect. And then, as I said, in the 60s, Navy mandated the use of these fire retardant AFFF, which contain PFAS. So between the Navy mandating that they use a lot of this foam, there's a huge gap in our understanding, primarily because of lack of epidemiologic studies. It wasn't until 2013 that epidemiologic studies into the effect of PFAS compounds was begun. And that was begun in a study called C8, which started in West Virginia. I'll talk about that in just one second. But it was an enormous study and led to a lot of outcomes associated with PFAS exposure. But another 3 years later, the National Toxicology Program, which is part of the NIH, finally decides that PFOA, one of the PFASs, is presumed to be an immunological hazard. So many of you have heard me talk about the value of the immune system. When you suppress the immune system, not only do you open yourself up to various kinds of infection, but basically you open yourself up to virtually all kinds of cancer. Virtually everybody has cancer at one time or another in their lives, but they don't know it because their immune system has beaten it. So suppressing the immune system is not something you want to try to do. And then it was only, 4 years ago, the International Agency for Research on Cancer classified PFOA, again, one of the 4,700 PFAS compounds, as a probable human carcinogen. So there's a real lag, there's a real gap between, okay, these things are out there, and maybe they're not doing us such a great, doing us any favors. And in 2018, the NIH now has started investigations, epidemiologic investigations into possible correlations between human exposure and all of these cancers down here. Some of them have already been pretty well associated with PFAS exposure. So the C8 study I was talking about began down here in West Virginia, near Parkersburg, West Virginia. You may have heard about this from the movie Dark Waters, which came out about a year ago. This was a case of a massive contamination from a DuPont facility of the watershed in this particular area, where all kinds of bad biologic outcomes were seen, first in the cattle that were in that area and then in the humans. And the only good news from that was that the settlement included a required study, a study called the C8 study that required DuPont to pay for a study to determine if exposure to their chemicals had caused any ill effects. Up until this point, DuPont knew about 10 years before this, or 15 years before, they knew that these compounds were likely dangerous to humans, but did not say anything about it, rather the contrary. Anyway, from this study, several outcomes have been determined, including by some scientists like Veronica Vieira, who is part of our BU Superfund research program, that came up with the following conclusions: that exposure to just 8 of the PFASs, including PFOA, was associated with a 2.6-fold increase in kidney cancer risk. That's a significant increase. For breast cancer, which we focus on here at Find the Cause, was a 50% increased risk in adults, a 2-fold increased risk in young women. That was a Taiwan study. That PFOA is associated with a 7.7-fold increased risk of estrogen receptor negative breast cancer if you were going to get cancer. So if you were going to get breast cancer, there was a 7-fold increase. You'd have one of the most aggressive forms of breast cancer if you were exposed to relatively high doses of PFOA, like people in the West Virginia area. For testicular cancer, the men don't get away with anything. There's a 2.8-fold increase in risk. For pre or postnatal exposure to those 6 PFASs, again, 6 of the many, levels of antibodies to childhood vaccinations has decreased 20 to 30% for every doubling of the dose. This study was done by a colleague of ours, Philippe Grandjean at Harvard. And what this means is that if you have X amount of P4 or these PFASs in your body, if it doubles, your response to a childhood vaccine decreases by 20 or 30%. So if it doubles 3 or 4 or 5 times, you may have your antibody response to childhood vaccines. And again, once you suppress the immune system, then you open yourself up to lots of other things. So these are epidemiologic studies, but epi studies are fabulous, but they do have some limitations. And here are some of the impediments. First of all, there's 4,700 plus PFAS chemicals, including the legacy, the ones that have been around, and their substitutes, of which we know not much. It's very expensive to determine where these things are. There's no real method for measuring any of them or some of them in human blood. And therefore, today we mostly study just 6 to 8. Even when you study them and you find them, it's hard to determine what an exposure level is. It's hard to know what someone has been exposed to over various periods of time. That exposure may have contributed to a cancer, and it may have happened, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago. So it's very hard to determine what the exposure was. And that makes determining associations between exposure and some cancer, for example, very difficult. And now we know that there's a possible transgenerational transfer of the biologic effects. I've spoken about this before for Find the Cause, and happy to talk about it a little bit further. It sounds a little heretical, but there is a possibility that the exposure your grandmother had may have been passed on to you and then on to your child. Okay, so what we do in the laboratory is, instead of doing all these epidemiologic studies, we do what I call the walks like a duck and swims like a duck and quacks like a duck. It's a duck. So you do studies in tissue culture with human cells or in small animals like mice. And if you see something that looks like you give a certain amount of a PFAS to an animal and something bad happens, then you're pretty sure that it's capable of causing these bad outcomes, and that exposures for humans are probably not a good idea. So in the lab, I'm going to show you a couple of areas in which it's been shown that these chemicals do cause adverse biologic effects, all of which are consistent with their ability to induce cancer. So I'm going to focus primarily on cancer here, since that's what we do at Find the Cause. So the first thing that I'll talk about is the ability of the PFAS compounds to shorten telomeres on DNA. So DNA is made up of lots of genes lined up, and they form together in large clumps called chromosomes. Normal cells, this is the very tip of this chromosome. Normal cells, every time they divide, you lose a little bit of that, and it's sort of a clock that ensures that at some point there will not be enough of the telomere left for the cell to replicate, and the cells will die. So it's basically planned obsolescence for cells, so they don't become immortal, although it may sound okay on one level. The cells aren't immortal, they die at a certain point, because if they become immortal, that's a characteristic of a cancer cell. So you don't want to be increasing the size of the telomeres, which is what some of these PFAS compounds do. Secondly, it's been shown that PFAS compounds will affect which genes are expressed. So here's a classic double helix of DNA, and it's made up of, in humans, 20,000 or so genes. Those genes, or expression of those genes, that when transcribed and translated into protein, make a cell do anything. It's really which of those genes gets expressed that determines what a cell does, or what you look like, or sometimes how you will act. So you don't want to mess with regulation of how these genes are expressed. But it turns out that these PFAS compounds will in fact alter the structure of the DNA, not the sequence, but the structure of the DNA in a way that changes which genes get expressed. So you don't want to mess with which genes get expressed. Then there is something that you may be more familiar with, which is the effect of endocrine disruption. So several of these chemicals have been shown to bind to the estrogen receptor. So that's another term you may have heard is a xenoestrogen. Estrogen is associated with breast cancer, so having an inappropriate activation of this estrogen receptor can predispose to breast cancer. Some of the compounds also bind to a thyroid hormone receptor. That's not a great idea. The thyroid hormone controls growth of cells. So that's a very well studied and understood mechanism of malignant transformation. And then finally, as I mentioned before briefly, several of these compounds have been shown to suppress the immune system in humans and in animals as well. The immune system is made up of multiple complementary components that interact with one another, and these compounds have been shown to affect adversely several of those components of the immune system. And once again, the consequence of suppressing your immune system is an increased susceptibility to virtually all cancers. And we've shown that, and many people have shown that in the laboratory. So just to widen the view just a little bit before we go into what's in your water, I'll just list some of the other health effects of PFAS that are known up till this point. So remember, these compounds had not been studied until very recently, maybe most intensive, I would call not considered intensively until maybe 3 years ago. So in both men and women, these compounds seem to contribute to thyroid disease. In some studies that were done by a colleague of mine, Jennifer Schlesinger, in my department, the Environmental Health Department, and Wendy's department, also a member of our BU Superfund research program, showed that PFAS compounds can affect cholesterol levels and levels of other lipids that are not heart healthy. They can cause liver damage, as I mentioned, kidney cancer, testicular cancer. In women, delayed mammary gland development, as I mentioned, reduced response to vaccines. So that would be a fetal exposure. It can reduce their response to a childhood vaccine after they're born. And that gets back to the idea that 100% of human milk is contaminated with PFAS. A lower birth weight, obesity may be associated with PFAS. Early puberty onset, increased miscarriage risk, low sperm count mobility. This usually shows up as just a marker of one of the possible biologic effects in humans in various contexts. But it gets my attention, not just because I'm a man, but because the species needs to have a certain number of sperm produced or else it doesn't propagate. And there are now many chemicals that seem to affect sperm count. So that's a very big thing and something to really worry about. So what about my water? So I'll leave this to Dr. Heiger-Bernays to talk about something that's a little more, you may think of as a little more relevant to actually your situation and your condition. So Wendy?
Great. Thank you, Dave. And thank you to Caitlin, Drew, and the organization for allowing us to come and speak with you today. So I wanted to present this because Dave showed you all of the things that we've found PFAS used for. And what happens when we use all of these products, they have to be made somewhere. On the left side with industry, they get made, such as in Parkersburg, such as in other factories. Those then get made into consumer goods or firefighting foam. And after we use those, they end up in wastewater or they end up in landfills. They then move in the environment because they're very mobile. Remember, these are stain and water resistant, so they're able to move very rapidly in the environment. And they end up in water, in surface water, and in groundwater. And then they get taken up into food, and multiple ways are humans exposed. So for the rest of today, we're going to talk about drinking water because that's what we're dealing with today. But I do want you to know that there is plenty of research that is developing that is examining our exposures through air, because these are semi-volatile chemicals, through dust, the dust in our homes that may have accumulated with PFAS because of the carpets and the textiles, and food and water. So drinking water is the primary pathway of PFAS exposure in contaminated sites, like contaminated locations like in West Virginia. In West Virginia, that forced an acknowledgement and a recognition that there was PFAS elsewhere. Over time, this is showing you a map. Why? Because the question is, why now? Why are we only finding out now? So in 1999, we started with the West Virginia. That purple dot is Parkersburg. We moved to 2010, where this investigation was expanded to other places that were known to either manufacture or use PFOA. Then we moved to situations where it was recognized that the firefighting foam, particularly on military bases, was contributing to the contamination of people's groundwater. And the groundwater is used as a drinking water source. 2016 was really when we saw an explosion of chemical methods for analysis of drinking water and other media, and two, a recognition that this was much more pervasive than previously thought. And so we went from having very small numbers of communities identified to now very large numbers of places where PFAS is measured in the groundwater and subsequently in the drinking water. Dave, next slide, please. So let's get to the drinking water, because once the water was recognized as being contaminated in West Virginia, the state of West Virginia proposed a drinking water standard of thousands of what we call parts per trillion. Now, parts per trillion is such a small number, frankly, that in my 25 years of working in this field, I have never seen anything in this very, very low range. I can give you the example of, how many drops in a swimming pool. The point is, it's an extremely low concentration that it has been very difficult to measure very low concentrations until about 4 years ago. So thousands of parts per trillion were identified in West Virginia as a safe level in drinking water. Over time, those levels have decreased. They decreased then in Minnesota. They decreased then in a number of other states. There is no federal drinking water standard for PFAS. There is a drinking water guideline, which means it's actually a health advisory. It says if it's in your water at greater than 70 parts per trillion, you may want to do something about it. So what happened was the states started to develop their own drinking water standards, because it's clear that the feds are not going to do that. And so what happened was really New England took the lead on this. Over time, Vermont identified a very low, it was the lowest at the time, of 20 parts per trillion. And that was the sum of 5 of these different PFAS. Then a number of other states, New York and New Jersey and California and several others, identified drinking water standards, all in the range of about, 10, 15 to 70. 2 years ago, Massachusetts identified a drinking water standard of 20 parts per trillion for the sum of 6 specific PFAS compounds. Dave, next slide. So the 6 that are listed, or the 6 that are regulated, are listed up at the top. You'll recognize PFOA as the grandmother of all PFAS. That's the Teflon chemical. PFAS is the substitute, which was supposed to be less toxic than the parent, but PFAS is actually more toxic than the parent. And then these other chemicals are all substitutions. They were all intended to be less toxic than PFOA and just as useful. Well, they are just as useful, but they're not less toxic. So we have 6 chemicals that we look at in Massachusetts. Dave mentioned a chemical called Gen X. That's not actually the next generation of chemicals. It's actually a chemical that has the name Gen X. It's manufactured in North Carolina, and it has heavily contaminated, or it has really received a lot of attention in North Carolina, which is beneficial to us here in Massachusetts, because there's a lot of money put into studying the toxicology, the epidemiology, and the measurement of that chemical. So I put here the calculation for a drinking water standard. The bottom line is, what we do is we go to the laboratory literature, we go to the toxicological literature, and we ask, what is the dose of this chemical that is protective of the most sensitive effect? And in this case, the most sensitive effect is the developmental effect on the fetus. And then we use that dose and we derive a drinking water standard from that dose. And we take into account how much water a pregnant woman drinks, what is a pregnant woman's body weight, and shall we assume that PFAS in their daily lives only comes from drinking water, or shall we recognize that there are other sources in the daily exposures as well? And that's what is done in deriving a drinking water standard. So we say that 20% of our daily exposure comes from the drinking water, and we're going to allocate 80% from somewhere else. That says that, and when we do that calculation, we come up with this number of 20 parts per trillion, which is wicked low when you really think about it. So let's go to the next slide. So Massachusetts promulgated the standard, which means it went into law. And part of the law was not only are we going to set a drinking water standard, but they also said that every public water supply is going to be required to test for the presence of these 6 chemicals, and in this particular and in a set time frame, and the state would pay for that testing. There is a second round of testing that must be done, and that's often considered a confirmatory sample just to make sure you got it right. There's 2 other provisions in that law that say that the state is now required to revisit the drinking water standard in 3 years and ask, is it low enough? Have we been protective enough? And so that will be revisited in another year and a half. And there are other provisions as well. There's money set aside for private drinking water wells. There are grants available to cities and towns should they exceed this drinking water standard of 20 parts per trillion. And oh, by the way, if bottled water is going to be provided, is there PFAS in the bottled water? Where did that come from? Okay, next slide, please. So this is the Wellesley results, and I pulled Wellesley because Caitlin asked. We started this conversation in Wellesley, and on your city or town's drinking water, on your city or town's website should be some information. And some towns are more forthcoming than others. And Wellesley has this information, and you see in the left, sort of the left column, it identifies where the water sample was taken. And there are 3 drinking water treatment plants. And then there is also some purchased water by entry point to the distribution system. So the Greater Boston Drinking Water Supply also provides some drinking water to Wellesley. Then there's the monitoring period. When was the sample collected, and when was it analyzed? So that's the monitoring period, the sample collection date, the PFAS 6 results. That is the sum of those 6 concentrations, and the average concentration is what it will appear once you get the second or the confirmatory sample, so you can create an average, and a comparison with the MCL, or the maximum contaminant level. And MCL is legally enforceable. So the city or town must comply with that standard. And what that means is that there will be ongoing monitoring, and there needs to be a plan in place to decrease the level of PFAS in that water over a period of time. Dave, next slide, please. So I thought it would be very useful. I do this with my students, and I ask them, well, where does your water come from? And they sort of look at me and they go, the tap. And I say, well, you know, yeah, we turn on the faucet and water comes out, but where does it come from? And in this country, we have public water supplies and we have private water supplies. And the public water supplies are defined by the number of people served by that water system over a period of time. And there are different types of public water supplies. For our purposes, we will say that public water supplies are those water supplies that are regulated under the Safe Drinking Water Act by EPA. And what happens is the EPA then gives money to the states to go ahead and regulate the public water supplies. Private water supplies are what you have in your backyard. And I see many people on the call probably come from communities that have private water supplies, and private water supplies are not regulated under the Safe Drinking Water Act. So there is no obligatory regulation for your private drinking water supply. Massachusetts, in developing the drinking water standard, has also set aside monies where UMass is responding to a number of communities to check their drinking water in their private wells. And so I'm happy to talk about that later. What I want to do is give you a website. I think Dave is this is the link. Dave, we can put it in the chat, but what I thought I would do is share with you what you can find on this website for your own drinking water. So I'm going to share my screen. Is that right, Dave? Dave? Okay.
Also, while we're at it, just everyone else, please make sure that you're muted. I'm hearing some typing. Obviously taking copious notes.
I cannot share my,
Should be able to.
okay, I'll see what I find here. Are you seeing my, I'm sorry about this.
I did for a second. Yep, there it is.
Okay. Can you see it?
Yep.
Okay, so this is the data portal for the Energy and Environmental Affairs, and we can go in and we can search for water, drinking water. So what we can do is we can go to the town, and just because we've been using Wellesley, I'll just go down and I'll put Wellesley in here. And for today, I'm interested in the PFAS, but there's a whole lot of things you can look for in your drinking water supply. So we're going to go to PFAS, and then I have a choice. Am I looking at raw or finished water? Raw water is the water that comes from the groundwater or the surface water. It is the water before it enters the treatment plant. The finished water is the water that comes out of the treatment plant that is then distributed to your homes. So I'm going to select finished water, and then I'm going to search and see what I find. Dave, you're not going to sing?
No. High
Why is it
octane.
not doing it? It's like, because everybody's on this website now? Oh, there we go. Okay. So what I get are the data that have been submitted to Mass DEP for Wellesley. I've got every drinking water supply has an identification name, identification number, a name, a town, a category, and I'm going to, how do I do this so we don't have to take the time? What you can do is you can then export the data, and you can see exactly what is in each of the treatment plants for your community. And so we've got the Morses Pond treatment plant, the Wellesley Avenue treatment plant, and then what we see, we will get the individual data for each of those locations. Actually, I think what I'd like to do is stop sharing and reshare so that you can see. So what I have here, I'll bigify it. What I have here then is actually the result. So column H is the result. That's the concentration that's actually measured. You'll see that there are often non-detects. So non-detects are not zero. Non-detects refer to the actual level that that test can measure. So non-detect, when you have a non-detect, you have to move over and you have to look to see what is the reporting limit. And the reporting limit is the concentration that is the lowest concentration that could be measured by that method. So you see here we have 1.91 parts per trillion, which is the lowest level that can be measured. Let's call it 2, which means that if we're looking at 6 PFAS chemicals and the lowest level we can measure is 2, If we add them up, we're already at possibility of 12 parts per trillion. So that is the reality of how we measure and what we can find. But these data are available to you. I'm going to stop sharing unless anybody has any questions, or should I wait, Dave?
Yeah, just quickly go through the next part. Let's leave some time for
Okay.
questions because people are going to want to know what to do about Morse Pond, et cetera.
Okay. And so then the other thing I wanted to show you was there's this really, I got to share my screen. I'm sorry. There it is. Okay. This is called a storyboard. And this is a storyboard that the state is maintaining. And the storyboard, you can open it up and click on it. I will put the link right in the chat. And what you can see, you can move through this and look at all the testing, how it's done, what the data look like across the state. And you can just get a real feel for nothing in the ocean, but for how much testing is ongoing and what the levels look like across the state. So I'm going to stop sharing. And now, Dave, you want to go back to the slides?
Sure. I think that's it.
Am I seeing the slides? Is anybody seeing the slides?
Not yet. 1 second. Let's check that. 1 moment. Okay.
Okay. Okay. So that's a little bit about the tap water.
1 moment.
Okay. So how do we get it out of the water once it's in the water? So one of the things is that your cities and towns are looking at how they can get it out of their water, right? And a study was done very recently to look at the efficacy of removing PFAS using some of the common methods that might be available. Brita filters, for example, refrigerator door filters, activated carbon filters, under the sink filters, and whole house filters. And what they did was they did a really nice study where they collected water from across a portion of North Carolina where that Gen X stuff is located. But they also had PFOA and PFAS and PFNA, as shown in the left graph, where they were asking, what is the percent removal of PFAS from this water with different methods? And what they showed was that you have better removal of the larger PFAS compounds, like Dave showed you, the C8, the C9, the C10, than you do the shorter compounds. But you also have more removal when concentrations are higher, because remember, this is a percent removal, not an absolute removal. So if you have a large amount, like thousands of parts per trillion, and you use a filter, you're actually going to be able to remove more than you are if you have a small amount of PFAS in your water. So their conclusions were such that they were able to conclude that activated carbon-based systems provide some removal of PFAS. And that's the ones that we would be using typically in our kitchen, under our sink, and that the under sink reverse osmosis, the really expensive one, was even better at removing PFAS. Brita and similar pitcher filters that don't have the actual activated carbon filters do not remove PFAS. And in fact, they actually, they bleed through and you might get slugs of PFAS. But what's also known is that the smaller PFAS compounds are able to come through the filter. So bottom line is there is some removal from under sink filtration devices. There is more removal from what we call point of entry, which is into the house, those devices. But it's not good to rely on Brita and similar pitcher filters at this time because they don't have the right kind of processing to be able to do that. Dave, next slide. So what can we do? Like, we're inundated with this stuff. And I actually want to also mention that this stuff is really useful, right? I mean, this stuff, you know, where you don't want something to stick, it doesn't stick, where you want stain protection, you know, you get it with this stuff. But there are still essential uses, right? And so we want to make sure that, you know, in our medical devices, where we don't want stuff to stick on the medical devices, some of our pharmaceuticals are actually PFAS. Dave, our laboratory supplies are contain PFAS. But there are things that we can do to decrease our exposure. And those include understanding your water supply. That information is public information. You need to become the experts on your water supply. You can examine the PFAS data that Mass DEP has collected. Understand what your levels look like compared with the 20 parts per trillion. You can read labels, and you've been reading labels, I'm sure, for a very long time. And now we have to read the labels that say, labels should say fluorine free, not PFOA free, not PFAS free, but fluorine free. Test your water, get your home water tested. It's not a very expensive test to be able to do that. The costs are coming down. On the Mass DEP website that maybe Dave can pop into the chat, you can see the certified laboratories. You want to make sure you go with a certified laboratory. Otherwise, you're going to get data that are questionable. You want good data. Use a filter. Know that they're not 100% effective, but depending upon what your concentrations are, if they're elevated, you know, above the 20 parts per trillion, then using a filter is a good thing. You do not want to boil your water. If you boil your water, you will concentrate the PFAS in the water. Again, so there are a couple of other initiatives going on that you might want to get involved in. I mean, our time is like sucked up by everything, but there are a couple of initiatives that you just want to keep your eye on. One is the Toxics Use Reduction Institute, which is actually a I'll call it semi-governmental agency in Massachusetts. Right now, they are trying to get PFAS recognized as a class of chemicals, not addressing every single one individually. That will bring us a long way to regulation, because then we can say a class of PFAS, because at this rate, we're never going to be able to regulate and remove one at a time if we've got 4,700 to deal with. There is a statewide PFAS interagency work group. I'm not going to editorialize, but it will be good to see because so many communities are impacted now. And I leave you the link to mass.gov. And I will tell you that the people we work with at Mass DEP they look for the science. They want the real deal. We've been working with colleagues who are at another Superfund research program. And so I'm actually really proud that they are working with the science as we move forward. So I'm going to end there because I'm sure there are a lot of questions. I don't know how we want to do this.
Well, people can just pop in with the questions, unmute and jump in if you have some.
Hey, Wendy, this is Michael Lindgren. I'm just curious. I know that generationally, we tend to think differently about these types of things. What are your students surprised, and they probably aren't, but by this kind of information, one, and do you find that they're motivated and activated to do things about it?
Our students are. This is why they came into this field, right? And they are studying the science, but they're really at that intersection of the science and using that science for decision making. I think they have heard so much about this whack-a-mole problem, right? Which is we study a chemical, it's shown to be really toxic and have effects that we're really concerned about. Industry goes back and reformulates and creates something that's supposed to be a better substitute, and then the substitute is more toxic. And I think for the students and the next gen, I'm very encouraged that they're hearing about all of these toxic chemicals, and they're wondering why are they here, and who's regulating, who's minding the store, so to speak. I think it also comes back to consumer, our consumer habits. We all want this and that and the other thing, but we're not willing to ask the questions often about, so what happens to that stuff when we're done with it? Or is that stuff safe? And there are a lot of NGOs now out there who are really devoting really good time and energy to helping us figure out what that is. And Michael, I don't know if I've answered your question. I have no idea.
No, you have, and I only asked this because what is the next gen? Obviously, it's eliminating these chemicals in our environment, but they're there.
Yes.
So it's also eliminating them from coming into and intruding our bodily space. Is the next generation of nanotechnology and biology and engineering that comes together going to help us solve this with microbes? And I say this in the layperson's way of saying something that actually binds with fluorine and eliminate. I don't know. I guess I'm hopeful.
It's a really so the people who are thinking about this waste problem and this cyclical forever chemical are really not the people who are working on the next sort of innovative technology. You never see, a call from NSF or NIH for, hey, we got this stuff out there. It causes these outcomes, right? And we need to figure out a better way to do all of our technology. So there is a real serious disconnect. There's not a lot of money put into this research space either. So I would like to be more hopeful. The problem is in order to get rid of this stuff, you have to burn it at wicked high temperatures. That is the only way to get rid of it. And there is some question even at that point. So I see some questions that maybe I can just go through. Okay. Do we need to worry about this when showering? So at the concentrations that are being measured in Massachusetts, the evidence so far strongly suggests that showering is not an issue. Dermal absorption of PFAS at these are low levels is not an issue, because PFAS biologically has to get into the body using cellular mechanisms, transport systems. The evidence so far suggests that this is not a problem at these concentrations. Although, again, data would be very useful to understand exactly what that concentration is. So there was a question earlier, I think, about Morse's Pond in Wellesley. And my response to that is go test the water. Ask your Board of Health. Test the water. You test it for microbes, test it for PFAS. Get the answer. Don't conjecture. Can you inhale it? So at levels that we're finding in the tap water, the inhalation path, the inhalation route is extremely negligible. If even, we went through that estimate to try and figure out whether the drinking water ingestion route was the most important, or whether we also had to consider inhalation. The answer to that is not. We do not have to. We do not have. That's one thing we don't have to worry about. Is it in our air in our homes? Absolutely, because it's from our textiles and our paints and our waxes. Okay. Can we presume that bottled water is PFAS free? No, you cannot. Because bottled water comes typically from, it often comes from public water supplies. And so what you would want to see is a documentation that the batches of, that they are routinely testing PFAS in the bottled water. Mass DEP does do some of that, and you could actually contact them and get their information. Somebody raised the issue of plastics and containing PFAS. Those are the HDPE plastics, the very heavy plastics that contain PFAS, not the water bottle plastics. So bottled water is not a solution in my mind. It is a stopgap, but it creates more waste. And it exposes us to things like BPA and other things that we'd like not to be exposed to. Okay, when trying to select a water filter, how do I know that it is filtering out at the mass? So you will not know whether it is filtering out at the mass state standard. You will know what the efficacy is. So you're going to need to test your water at the get-go, and then you're going to have to, I would recommend taking a sample after you've filtered it and see what the level is, right? And so what you're really looking at is efficacy and percent removal. So more information is out there. I'm happy to provide it offline if you want, but if it in my home, test it, get some data, test it again after you filtered, and you've got the data. I see from our town's Chatham notification that Mass DEP has some voluntary bottle water testing. Great. So DEP has gotten burned in the past where there have been water quality issues. They brought in bottled water, and the bottled water contained another or a similar contaminant. So they are trying to be very responsive to this issue. I mean, one thing we could certainly request is of bottled water providers, share your data. Should I post it here? Oh, please ask. Kylie. Let's see if there were other questions. Well, she's unmuting. So do we know the source of contamination in every town? We don't. We don't know what it is in Wellesley. It is not known. It may be from firefighting foam, where every community fire department was using fluorinated firefighting foam. And when it is sprayed on a house or a building, that foam penetrates into the ground and ultimately into the groundwater. So even a very little bit of fluorinated firefighting foam can contaminate an entire aquifer. We also know that when houses burn, right, the release from the construction materials also releases PFAS because of all the construction materials that contain PFAS. So there have been programs for municipal firefighting facilities to a buyback program where the material that is being used to fight fires is bought back by Mass DEP, and it is replaced with presumably firefighting foam that is free of fluorine, but now we're learning that it is actually not entirely free. And so it's got less, but it's that forever problem.
Kylie, do you want to unmute and ask your question? There you go.
Yes, hi, thank you so much. I am a local advocate for wildlife and animals, and I see so much of this conversation focused on human health and human which totally makes sense because we're humans. But it's a little hard for me to detach sometimes because we create most of our own problems. And then I see wildlife, who to me is just the most innocent on the planet. They live within the rhythms of this planet. And I'm just curious as to how, is there testing being done on wildlife? They have much more raw drinking water sources than us. Is there anything that we can do to advocate more for wildlife? I know that tons of people are advocating for the humans, which is incredible, like I said, but I do often worry about even my local. I live across from a canal and it is just so dirty and so bad. I see dead animals all the time. So I guess I'm just curious as to what's being done to protect wildlife from this horrific problem. And also,
Yeah, no, I really appreciate what you're asking and what you're doing. I'm putting a paper in the chat, and that paper was a consortium of people, myself included, that looked at the pathways of PFAS exposure across wildlife and humans. And what it really does is it illustrates exactly your point. So the reality is that we actually do have quite a bit of testing on ecologic species. These are sentinels, right? And so as Dave said, if it looks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, it must be a duck. He showed the duck, I have to say. I thought he was showing it because the water runs off the duck's back. And I was like, oh, it's coated in PFAS. But it's not to take this lightly, but you're absolutely correct. There are data and there are concerns. And I actually think what's happening is, in addition to addressing water supply, we are now looking at what is happening with wastewater discharge, right, to the waterways. And the wastewater discharge is first and foremost going to affect the wildlife, the ecologic system. And so in many cases, those levels are not going to be based on human health, right, but are going to be based on ecologic health. And so I think from the water perspective, that's a little bit easier. I think from the land perspective, the way the organisms are looked at is as sort of sentinels for elevated concentrations. And what we know is that we are seeing elevations, certainly in earthworms. There were great studies that were done at ski slopes, right, where people actually looked at ski wax contained PFAS, right? That's what made it fast. So the wax leached into the snow, which hit the ground, the earthworms, the plants, the groundwater, the fish, where the groundwater discharged. So fish is now a very significant focus of PFAS, in part, of course, because people eat fish and because that's what gets the attention of, right, of the regulators and of the government to allocate resources. So they're not buried, they're not absent, Kylie, they are there, and the data are out there for the effects of PFAS on their health and the health of the ecosystem.
Great. I think there's one more question in the chat, and just to be conscious of everybody's time.
PFAS, not peas.
Oh, if you go up a little bit, is there a process to remove PFAS from the body?
Oh, is there? Because I was thinking peas, which is the site where the testing is going on for the health outcomes associated with exposure. Is there a process to remove PFAS from the body? No, there is no process. Over time, we know that, so we measure PFAS in serum, right? Or in blood. It's actually blood. We measure it in blood, not in urine. And the reason for that is a very long half-life in the body. But what we know is over time in this country, blood levels are decreasing. And that is a really good thing. But there is nothing to remove the PFAS from the body. It's not like chelating metals. But over time, those concentrations will decrease. And as you remove sources, known sources, what you'll see ultimately is a decrease in PFAS levels. I included somewhere a link to, there's a group called CSWAB, which is out in Wisconsin, and they have been dealing with DOD contamination of their drinking water supply. DOD is responsible for an enormous amount of contamination. And what they've done is they've put together a medical information sheet. So there are ways to measure PFAS in blood. Insurance companies don't cover it. It's expensive. It's about $1,000. And the issue is, what do you do with that information? Since we don't know what the relationship is specifically with health outcome, all we would be doing, and maybe this is important, is to understand what our levels look like compared with others in the United States or others in other communities.
This was a ton of information. I thank you so much for doing this. I think everybody learned so much just about, what PFAS is, where it came from, why is it suddenly a hot topic of conversation, why are these levels starting to hit, in the 58 or so communities in Massachusetts. There was a testing differential that brings it to our attention. And I think this is just the beginning of this big iceberg. So maybe we could revisit this topic at another time when we learn a little bit more in other communities. But for today, we're delighted to send out the link to this recording to those that registered for today's webinar, because there is a lot of information in here and it's a lot of great information. So feel free to share that out. And by all means, we encourage you to follow the science with Find the Cause, check in on what the labs are doing and the great research, and give us a like on social media so we can give you some updates along the way. My huge thank you to David and Wendy today. This was awesome. If you ever have a good idea about wanting to do a presentation, go to David, because he'll say, not only can we do it this way, we can do it this way, and get some friends involved. So I appreciate both of you for your willingness to share your expertise on something that is such a timely topic. So thank you very much. And on behalf of everybody, we really appreciate your participation today.
Thank you for having us.
Yep, thanks. Pleasure to do it.
Bye.
Awesome. Thank you.
Bye all.
It's great. Thank you.